Hi guys, I was getting some questions from this section from chapter 23, the overhead variances. So I just wanted to go through part of that chapter. This is from the PowerPoints that I already posted, but I just wanted to work through a couple problems there. Most people seem okay with the direct material and the direct labor variances, as those are a little bit more straightforward. So I just wanted to go through the overhead variances. And with the overhead variances, the differences are between the actual overhead costs and the standard that's allocated. And allocated, remember, is going to use that predetermined overhead rate, and it's always going to be that times the standard quantity for actual production. So when they go in to the and if you review the journal entries for this part of the chapter, we see we put everything in to work in process and that at standard. So that means when we're applying the overhead rate, we're doing it at the standard. So the standard for that level of production. So that's I'll show you. It might make more sense when I do problems. So the standard overhead allocation rate, we calculate that just like the predetermined overhead rate. Here's what we think the overhead's going to be. Here's how many units we think we're going to have, and that gives us that. And then we take that times the standard quantity for actual production. So if it's, well, I'll show you, that probably make more sense. But so you've got the standard quantity and you've got the actual output. So those, you've got two things going there. Okay, the variable overhead variances. We've got the variable overhead cost variance, which is the actual cost minus the standard cost. So the difference between what we thought we were going to have to pay and what we actually paid times the actual quantity. Sometimes you'll see it, what this really is, if you expanded this formula, what this really is the actual cost times the actual quantity minus the standard cost times the actual quantity. And so sometimes you kind of see it like this, because this is your actual, what you actually paid, and then this would be the actual quantity times the standard cost. So both of those will give you the same thing. It's really kind of a matter of how the information is presented to you. And the other one is the variable overhead efficiency variance, which is the actual quantity minus the standard quantity, so the difference in the quantity times the standard cost. So just like in the material and the labor variances, we have to hold one thing steady and then see the change in the other one. So for this one, we're looking at the change in the cost between what I expected to pay and what I actually paid. And here we're looking at the difference in the quantity between what I thought I was going to use and what I actually used, and then hold that at the standard cost. For the fixed overhead variances, we need three things. We need the actual fixed overhead, we need the budgeted, and then we need the allocated. So we need three things for those. So we have two different fixed overhead variances. The fixed overhead cost variance is my favorite of all the variances, and what do we do? 8 of them. This is my favorite. This is the actual fixed overhead, which will be given to you, and the budgeted fixed overhead, which will also be given to you. So we just have to subtract two numbers that are given to us. It's the easiest one, that's why it's my favorite. The fixed overhead volume variance is the budgeted fixed overhead minus the allocated fixed overhead. And remember that the allocated fixed overhead is going to be based on actual production. So it's going to kind of use that predetermined overhead rate times the standard quantity for actual output. Okay? So let's do two of these. Okay, so the first one here, we are going to come up with those rates. In a lot of the problems you'll see these rates are already given to you, but we'll go ahead and figure them out. So we want a variable overhead rate. So we're going to calculate the standard variable overhead allocation rate. And so we're expecting, we allocate overhead based on direct labor hours. So our variable overhead, we're expecting, so this will be, for both of these, it'll be the budgeted variable overhead divided by the budgeted, what I'm expecting in variable overhead divided by what I'm expecting in the allocation base, which in this case is direct labor hours. So in this case, that's 7,800 divided by 1,300 hours, and I get $6 per direct labor hour. I will do the same thing with the fixed overhead. So the standard fixed overhead allocation rate is the budgeted fixed overhead divided by the budgeted allocation base. So in this case, that is $3,900 divided by 1,300 direct labor hours, and so I get $3 per direct labor hour for fixed overhead. So these are my two allocation bases that I'll use for the next one. So now we've got Morgan Company, and again, this is in the demo problems if you want to follow along on there. And so their actual variable overhead was 10,800, and so that's the actual quantity times the actual cost, what they actually paid. Actual fixed overhead was 2,700. They produced 7,000 units at 0.2 direct labor hours. The standard is 0.25 direct labor hours, which is, if we go back here, 5,200 units and 1,300 hours would be the 0.25. Okay, so variable overhead cost variance is going to be, so if we did that out the long way, the actual cost times the actual quantity minus the standard cost times the actual quantity. Because that's kind of how they gave it to us in this problem. But otherwise, you could use it like this, if that's how you have the data. But in this case, since they gave us the actual, it's easier to use the long form of the same formula. So that minus, what I need here is the standard quantity, or the standard cost, which will be those predetermined rates that we used, okay? So for this one, for the variable overhead, we said that is $6 an hour. So $6 an hour times the actual quantity of hours that we used, which is 7,000 units, and we used 0.2. So 7,000 units, we used 0.2 hours per unit, so we used 1,400 actual hours. So 1,400 hours. So that means the standard for this is 8,400. So my actual cost was $10,800. What I thought it should have been for producing 7,000 units was 8,400. So the difference is 2,400, and that is unfavorable because my actual cost was more than I thought it should be for this level of production. So this already has, you know, they didn't give us the per unit rate over here in the actual. They just gave us the total, but we know they used 1,400 hours. So the variable overhead efficiency variance is the actual quantity minus the standard quantity times the standard cost. And again, in this case, standard cost equals, for variable overhead, equals the $6 an hour that we figured out on the last page. So the actual quantity we said right here is 1,400, right? We already said that one. So 1,400, the standard quantity. So for actual production here. So I made 7,000 units. My standard is 0.25 direct labor hours per unit. So that gives us 1750 is my standard quantity for 7,000 units. So what this tells us in English is that I thought to make 7,000 units it would take me 1750 hours, but it only took me 1400 hours. Okay, that's what that means in English. I take that times the standard cost, which is that predetermined rate, and I get 2100, and this is favorable because I used less hours than I thought I would. Then it wants the two fixed overhead, and fixed overhead cost. I'm gonna try and stick that. I'm gonna run out of room here. So fixed overhead cost variance, since that's a nice short one. The actual fixed overhead, which is 2770, they gave us that right here, minus the budgeted fixed overhead, which is they gave us that here, 3900. 3900. So the actual is less than my budgeted by 1130, and so that'll be favorable. Oops, because that's less than I was expecting. Okay, one more. Fixed overhead volume variance. Okay, so that'll be the budgeted fixed overhead, which we just said is 3900, minus the allocated. Okay, so the allocated is going to be the standard cost, which for the fixed overhead we said is $3 a unit. So in these, standard equals those allocation rates that we came up with. So the standard cost is $3 times the standard quantity. So the standard quantity for actual production. We already did that right here, okay? So that is the 1750. That is this one here. 7,000 units are actual production times the standard quantity, which is 0.25 hours per unit. So that gives me 5250. So 3,900 is my budgeted. What I allocated to the jobs was 5250. So that gives me a variance of 1350. I think, is that right? Yeah. I think they call that one favorable. Usually because you allocated more than you budgeted, so you've got it built into the job. Okay, so I think that's everything that we do in there. This number right here is kind of the tricky one. If you're doing all of them, you would have already got that number back up there. But remember that this one is the actual quantity times the standard production, or the standard quantity per unit times the number of units you actually produced, not what you were planning to produce. So those are the overhead variances. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hopefully you can read that okay, and let me know if you have any questions.